of classic Gothic style. It was built over a
Здравейте,
period of
приятели!
just 50
Поздрави
years in the
от
second
Леон
half of the 13th
и
century.
неговата
So it
великолепна
has a marvelous
катедрала.
unity of style and captures all the elegance and harmony of Gothic architecture. Even today, Gothic cathedrals continue to powerfully captivate our imagination. Sit down for a moment on the stone bench to your right at the foot of the wall, and we'll briefly explain the historic context in which they appeared.
In the midst of the Middle Ages, Europe found itself in a profound crisis, which had lasted since the fall of the Roman Empire. This was rural Europe, sparsely populated, the peasant Europe of serfs in subjection to their feudal masters. In the 11th century, Europe began to emerge from the tunnel, and there appeared and started to develop an artistic and unifying influence, the Romanesque style of architecture. Romanesque churches were full of heavy stone vaults. To bear this weight, the builders had to construct very thick walls with practically no windows in order not to weaken the structure, and with tremendous buttresses. The result was a solid and massive style which appeared in the building of countless rural churches and great monasteries throughout the 12th century. The population increased and the cities grew, with their guilds of artisans and merchants. So the bourgeois class was born, and with it a new urban culture, luminous and full of vitality. Europe was about to enter a time of cultural fullness, the peak of which was achieved in the 13th century when this cathedral was built. In the field of architecture, it was discovered that it wasn't necessary to build such massive vaults. It was enough to construct ribs which crossed each other, like the ones we can see overhead, and then fill in the remaining spaces with lighter material. Thus was born the crossed rib vault, which along with the ogival arch revolutionized building methods. It was the beginning of the Gothic style. It first appeared in northern France, around Paris, but soon spread over the whole of Europe. Walls can be higher and lighter, windows bigger. Buildings stretch, get larger, fill with light. The new style is grandiose and seems to have no limitations. The most important cities vie with each other to have the largest and most perfect temple. In just one century, more than 200 Gothic cathedrals were built throughout Europe. In Spain, the beginning of the 13th century is marked by the transcendent victory on the plains of Tolosa in the year 1212. The collapse of Muslim power accelerates, and it can practically be said that the reconquest has been achieved. In Christian kingdoms, there is an environment of cultural and religious euphoria, and it is then that the first Gothic cathedrals are built. Toledo, Burgos, Leon, as the best outward expression of this triumphal time. Construction of this Leon cathedral began around 1253 on the remains of the old Romanesque cathedral. Alfonso X, the Wise, had just ascended the throne of Castilla, and Leon, and during his reign all the sciences and arts flourished. While these walls were being built, the king was composing his very famous cantigas in the Romantic language, after having turned his court into an impressive cultural centre.
Let's stand up now and go back to where we began our visit. Now that we know a little about the historic context in which the cathedral was built, we are in a better position to understand its architecture. The first thing which draws our attention is the stained glass. The stone walls have been replaced by great quantities of little pieces of glass set in lead, and their magic surrounds us. There are about 1,800 square meters of stained glass, forming the richest and most spectacular collection of medieval Europe, together with that of Chartres Cathedral. The architecture is simple and elegant, as classic Gothic should be. There are 3 floors, as in French cathedrals. If we didn't have the choir wall in front of us, we would have a better view of the temple as a whole. Let's imagine that we don't have any obstacle between us and the altar, and let's admire this majestic nave of ascendant dynamism, radiating awesome sacredness. Everything in this cathedral seems to lead to God. That was the purpose of the builders, to bring to earth an image of the divine world, the mere contemplation of which would transport us to heaven. In order to achieve their aim, they stretched the possibilities of the stone to the limit, boldly defying the laws of gravity. But they used something still more eloquent than stone to speak of God: light. Gothic cathedrals, made of stone and light, are the closest thing to celestial Jerusalem. Some prefer to contemplate this cathedral in full daylight, with the sunshine bursting through the high windows. Others at dawn or dusk, when the sunlight is softer and filters in evanescent, bathing the interior and turning the whole temple into a true oasis of peace. It is especially worthwhile to imagine it during the solemn celebration of the Eucharist, with the nave and the aisles filled with the faithful, for it is then that the splendor of the sacred liturgy gives the cathedral its fullest and most transcendent meaning. Lastly, we must understand the role played by the sun in the iconographical program of the stained glass windows. As in almost all ancient churches, the head of the cathedral points towards the east, so that the first rays of the sun will strike the central windows of the apse. There we find represented the allegory of Christ's family tree, true light born on high, which shines throughout history to illuminate mankind and save it from sin and death. The only saving light which dispels darkness. As the day wears on, the sun travels over the windows on the southern side, where we find the great figures of the church, apostles, bishops, virgins and martyrs, whose lives are illuminated by the light of Christ, which transforms them into something akin to precious gems. As you can see on that right-hand side, warm colours predominate, with greater closeness. On the other hand, the windows on the northern side, to the left, never receive direct sunlight. There are the prophets and the persons of the Old Testament, who arrived in the world before the birth of Christ. They didn't experience his light, but advanced towards it, towards the east of salvation. That's why they have been rendered in colder tones of blue, which come alive indirectly, thanks also to the volumes of coloured light entering from the other side. The sun plays with the cathedral. Somehow it imparts life to all its creatures and awakens them to this great celestial celebration. It is like an attempt to call together the entire universe, so that it may join mankind in its praise of God.
We are going to tour the cathedral, starting with the right-hand nave. As we move forward, we can see close up the lower windows, decorated with vegetable motifs in the lancets and allegories of human realities in the rove windows, the sciences, the arts, virtues, vices. As a very general rule, we can say that at the base we find the mineral world depicted. Over that the vegetable kingdom, and in turn over that the world of mankind, capable of love and hate. In the highest places, in the upper windows, the church triumphant, with all its legions of the blessed. On reaching the point where the transept crosses the nave, we turn the corner and look on the right for an illuminated sepulchre set in the wall. Although it has greatly deteriorated, we can't pass it by, because here is buried the Bishop Martin Fernandez, counsellor and friend to Alfonso X. He governed the diocese from the very beginning of the construction work until almost the end of the 13th century, when the building was very advanced. He is therefore the person mainly responsible for this marvel of architecture, which amazes us to this day. For is it not a true miracle that a little city of just 5,000 inhabitants was able, in the 13th century, to carry out such an undertaking? We stand now in the centre of the cathedral, at the crossing, so called because this is where the transept crosses the nave, giving the cathedral its cross plan. The crossing is a privileged position to observe the stained glass windows and the two wheel windows. Wherever we turn our eyes, we find a captivating view. But now let's look at the altarpiece. At the beginning of the 15th century, Nicolas Frances painted 15 extraordinary panels in a late Gothic style, called International Gothic, to create an altarpiece which was installed here until the 18th century. Around then, the city fathers decided to replace it with another more in accord with the tastes of the time, and they set up in its place a huge one, showily baroque, which reached the roof, preventing the windows from being seen. That collided with the simplicity and purity of lines of this temple, as well as concealing the key to understanding it. So fortunately, in the 19th century, it was decided to dismantle it and replace it by the present one, reconstructed with the 5 surviving panels of the original altarpiece by Nicolas Frances, and other smaller ones brought from different churches. The image of the Virgin of Asunción at the centre is the only part of the Baroque altarpiece which remains.
We will continue now around the apsile behind the altar. A wooden ramp allows us access. The chapels which surround the apsile, of hexagonal shape, have not been added to in any important way, and conserve the simplicity and elegance of their original plan, which is part of their charm. We have chosen some details to comment on. Before we go on, we're going to stop at the third area on the left. Here is the so-called thistle door, used in the olden days to reach the altar from the vestry. Let us draw back a little to see it better. It is a painstaking piece of work, dating back to the 15th century, with arches which cross one another in complicated fashion, decorated with all kinds of mouldings, offset with thistle and oak leaves, fantastic animals, and other small items. This illustrates the difference between classic Gothic, with simple and elegant lines, as we have been seeing up to now, and late Gothic, which becomes affected. It is also called florid Gothic, or Isabelline Gothic, because it flourished at the time of Isabel la Católica of Spain. Tempted by their own technical abilities and expertise, the artists turned their creative genius to carrying out more and more complicated variations, bordering on the Baroque. Luckily, the radiant purity of this cathedral was practically unaffected. We continue along the apsile. Passing another 3 units, we find on our left the multicolored sepulchre of Ordonio II, one of the great kings of Leon. In the 10th century, after vanquishing the Moors at San Esteban de Gormaz, the king ceded his palace to build in its place a first cathedral-like temple, on the remains of which the Romanesque cathedral was later built. When the Gothic one in which we find ourselves was built afterwards, this privileged place was assigned to install a monumental sepulchre where the remains of that king, to whom the cathedral owes so much, are piously guarded. The sculptures on the lower part of the tympanum reproduce, as if in consecutive photographs, the crucifixion and descent. In the first, as well as the 2 thieves, the Virgin and St. John, Longinus appears, driving his spear into Christ's side. We can see him rubbing his eye with his left hand, because a drop of blood has fallen into it, which, according to legend, is blinding him. The descent is notable for the tenderness depicted in the participants, its movement, and great beauty of composition. The chapel behind us guards the image of the White Virgin. It is considered to be one of the highest exponents of 13th century sculpture in Castilla and Leon. For centuries, this statue stood in the mullion of the main door of the cathedral, on the western side. In 1954, it was moved to this chapel to prevent deterioration, and a copy was set in its place. The Virgin is holding the child on her left arm, while she turns her gaze full of mystery towards those addressing her. This was the first soothing balm received by a pilgrim on crossing the threshold of the temple. Her palace, said the medieval poets, because she is the queen, the majestic and tender mother of the king. She is crushing the malignant serpent, because Mary had been looked upon as the new Eve, who gave to the world the blessed fruit of her womb. The next chapel, to the right, holds an image especially dear to all the people of Leon. It is the pregnant Virgin, masterfully sculpted in stone at the end of the 13th century and polychromed centuries later. The Virgin, standing, is resting her hand on her belly, where the Incarnation is already present. Used as we are to seeing the Holy Mother with her Son in her arms, to see her pregnant with swollen belly seems to emphasize even more the reality of the Incarnation. This is the so-called Virgin of the O. We keep walking along the ambulatory. To our right, we leave behind the last hexagonal chapel, which houses a beautiful 15th century altarpiece of the Birth. And we focus on the following chapel, larger and more slender, preceded by a small square space, the anteroom. That was the former library of the cathedral, and it is now the chapel of His Holiness, although it is preceded by a modern group of sculptures that resembles the one of the Virgin of the Way. Amongst all its treasures, the Holy Sacrament is, without a doubt, the most precious one the cathedral houses. This chapel is destined for worship and prayer, but from the outside, without the need to go in, we can see that it is made in the same style we have called Florid Gothic or Isabelline Gothic, from the end of the 15th century and beginning of the 16th century, already parting ways with the classic Gothic style.
Let's go to the transept to continue our explanation, sitting on one of the benches. The Cathedral of Leon has always been a fragile building. Its builders made the structure so light in order to accommodate crystal that anything could disturb its delicate balance. Besides, sometimes they had used bad quality stone. Due to the lack of resources, they started building on the site of previous buildings, including Roman baths, with their hypocausts and soft land. Moreover, later on, and with new restorations, there were serious calculation mistakes, which altered the systems and their fragile balance. Sit on one of the benches. We'll tell you now about the dramatic restoration this cathedral underwent in the 19th century. The most notorious mistake was to erect a Baroque dome at the intersection of the two naves, right above our heads. This foreign body had been subjecting the building to enormous efforts for more than 2 centuries, when in 1857 pieces of the roof and fragments of the vaults began to fall, causing panic in the population. The Cathedral of Leon was declared a building that was wounded to death. Its first restoring architect was Matthias Lalinia, who started out by dismounting the Baroque dome and then all the south part of the transept, the one to our right, to its foundations, leaving the cathedral roofless. The operation was reckless and risky. Like a castle made of cards, when you remove some of the cards, the whole temple was threatening to collapse at any moment. The vaults that were still standing were starting to crack. At that moment, a providential man took over the restoration work, architect Juan de Madrazo. If it hadn't been for him, everything would have become ruins. After a thorough study of the Gothic building system, Madrazo devised and installed a complex framework of wood to support the vaults and to brace all the structural elements that were unbalanced. In this way, he succeeded in restoring balance among all the opposing forces. The cathedral had been saved. Madrazo and his successor, Demetrio de los Rios, worked to support this by ingenious scaffolding for 14 years. Finally, it was time to remove the wooden support and to see whether the old cathedral could stand for itself. The people of Leon were holding their breaths. When the scaffolding was eliminated, the vaults groaned when they came to rest on the pillars. Those were exciting moments for the cathedral, which showed it had regained completely stability. The restoration was carried on for many more decades. The facades were remade, regaining their original Gothic purity. The triforium, which had been bricked up, was reopened. Pillars, flying buttresses, and other structural elements were repaired, as were the pavement, gates, and tombs. They replaced the Baroque altarpiece with the current one, as we have explained. And finally, with utmost patience, they restored the windows, which had been dismounted piece by piece and stored in boxes. This was one of the most complex and risky restorations undertaken in all Europe. But the result was a sort of resurrection of the cathedral in all its primitive beauty. In In 1901, the temple was solemnly given back to the cult after almost half a century of restoration work. If we get up and turn around, we can see the chairs of the choir. Before, we said that the choir is an obstacle in the middle of the temple, which undermines the grandiose effect of the central nave. It was initially installed around the altar, but when the new Baroque altarpiece was installed, they had to change its location, a decision that raised an infinite number of disputes. For many, it is a pity that 19th century restorers did not finish their work and relocated the choir in its primitive place, as had been the idea. In any case, this seating is one of the most beautiful and delicate of the 15th century, a real jewel of Flemish art, carved with mastery and sensitivity, although from here we can't make out well this colossal piece of work. A parade of characters from the Old and the New Testament can be found here, as well as the most well-known and revered Christian figures of the time. The current organ of the Cathedral of Leon is one of the best in Europe. It was blessed on September the 19th, 2013, and was inaugurated 2 days later with a concert by the master, Jean Guillou, a true ideologue and visionary of a new concept of this instrument. It was paid for by the Ministry of Culture, the Governing Council of Castile-Leon, the Banc Caja España, the Leon Provincial Council, the Town Hall of Leon, and the Chapter House. It was made in Bonn, Germany, by the Klaus House, which was founded in 1882. It replaced another one from the 1950s, which was made by Organería Española. It has 5 keyboards and 1 pedal, 64 registers, 4,114 pipes, of which 4,021 are metal alloys of zinc, tin and lead, and 93 are walnut wood. 4 wooden oak boxes, 1 mobile console, and 8 facades. The Association of Friends of the Cathedral of Leon's organ helped to obtain this organ. That group is also the promoter of the famed Cathedral of Leon's Festival of the Organ, which started in 1984, and which has been attended by the best organ players in the world.
We are headed finally towards the choir wall. Before, we considered it an obstacle in the central nave of the church. Now we are going to stop at it, because it is a masterpiece of Spanish Renaissance. In this way, we are going to finish our visit to this Gothic monument with a style that meant its death, since with the Renaissance, the Middle Ages end and modernity starts. Standing now before this unique Arc of Triumph, we see there is an abundance of smaller reliefs around the 4 main scenes, 2 on each side of the centre. We can get closer in order to get a better look at them, since many of them are at eye level. The theme of these small and well-made ornaments is completely secular. With time, we could identify a lot of these gods and ancient myths, both Greek and Roman: Hercules, Apollo, Cupid, Venus. At that time, when the Renaissance, brought from Italy, had already got a foothold in these lands, the Church accepted these decorative motives as elements that had a place within the temple. However, the Council of Trent decided to purge pagan representations because they confused the faithful and diverted them from the pure, clean message of the doctrine. The 4 main panels, made in alabaster by Esteban Jordan, were made after the Council of Trent and are free from pagan themes. The scenes, filled with piety, move to devotion, just what the council wanted. The relief on the left, inspired by the apocryphal Gospels, represents the birth of the Virgin. Many women help the woman in labour who is lying down, while others tend to the newborn. On earth is the one who will bear the divine word, and we feel the proximity and the impatience of salvation. The following scene represents the Annunciation, and the remaining two, the Adoration of the Shepherds and the Epiphany. All this makes up an intense evocation of the arrival of the Saviour, that crucial moment in human history in which the Son of God, tearing eternity apart, introduces himself into time and lives with other men. It is easy to see how different these sculptures are from the ones in the Gothic tomb. Under the clothes we can see legs and arms with well-formed muscles, and there's a clear concern with perfection of the human figure. We have left the medieval God-centered world in which all lines lead to God, and have entered the Renaissance world, deeply man-centered, in which human realities have a value unto themselves, even if they are idealized.
Before finishing, let's take a look at the rosette at the entrance, which every day receives the last rays of the sun. 12 angels are playing their trumpets, announcing Judgment Day, as a sign for us not to lose track of our final destination. But, as always happens in this temple, the most tremendous messages are softened by the motherly presence of the Virgin Mary, who appears in the centre of the rosette, inviting us to trust. So we finish our visit to the Cathedral of Leon, a monument erected by the dreams of a whole town and an optimistic and luminous culture. Enraptured by their craziness and ambition, they wanted to create an image of the divine world here on earth, not knowing that it is impossible to do that. Although, in this case, nobody has ever come as close to achieving it.
We invite you to continue your visit in the cloister and the Cathedral Museum, which is one of the most important museums of sacred art in Spain.
Това, приятели, поздрави от изумително красивата катедрала Санта Мария в Леон. Поздрави!